Vermeer's paintings of women at home, alone with their thoughts, do have a strong spiritual quality. In this picture of a pregnant woman holding a balance, the painting on the wall in the background is a last judgment, showing the souls of the damned and the saved. It's a moment of solemn contemplation. She's thinking that the soul of her unborn child too lies in the balance. In this picture, a woman reads a letter, holding it in both hands as if to steady the trembling of her heart. Good news or bad, it's another of Vermeer's moments of suspense, a pregnant pause. The faded Delft blue of her dress makes her look like a contemporary Madonna in a secular Annunciation. Vermeer's images of pregnant women are unusual. No other Dutch artist painted the subject. They seem so perfectly, poignantly tranquil. But what lies behind this obsessively recurring dream of domestic peace and harmony? I think the answer to that question is the key to Vermeer's secret life. In 1662, at the age of 30, Vermeer was elected head man of the Guild of St. Luke in Delft. He was at the height of his profession. There's a record of a visit to his studio by a French gentleman diarist in the following year. Strangely, the artist said he had no paintings to show, so they went round the corner to a baker who owned a Vermeer which he claimed had cost him 600 guilders. The Frenchman thought it overpriced. The fact that Vermeer had no stock to show him may be because he worked to commission, or perhaps he wanted him out of the house as quickly as possible, because the evidence we have today suggests it wasn't necessarily a happy place. That year, Maria Tins's past caught up with her in the form of her unruly son, Willem, the boy who bared his arse at her in Gouda, who now bursts back into the household. The year is 1663. We don't know where Vermeer was, but Catharina was at home with their 3 daughters, pregnant again. Is this a notary's book?
This is a notary book, yes. This is a testimony of people who were there when Willem Bolnes misbehaved in the house of his mother. He said very ugly words as well, which could not be repeated.
Old popish swine and she-devil were 2 of the phrases they permitted themselves to record. Bolnes was in a rage.
The violence of the father seems to have been repeated in the violence of the son. Willem Bolnes thrust at his highly pregnant sister, Catharina, and he thrust at her with a stick at the end of which there was an iron pen.
According to the witnesses, it was Tanneke Everpole, the kitchen maid, who came to the rescue, putting herself between the pregnant Catharina and the stick-wielding Willem. What happened to him? I mean, is this deposition an attempt basically to get him sectioned, as we would say? I mean, have him put away?
Well, he was put away, and on this sort of testimonies, yes.
Well, I'm not surprised, really. Willem was in fact committed to a private house of correction run by a man called Hermanus Tierling. So the fact that Vermeer isn't in this document anywhere and he doesn't sign it doesn't mean that he doesn't care, it just means that he might not have been present, so he can't honestly witness the terrible things that Willem did.
Right.
I think a few months after this happens, we have this record that I read in another document that Willem has some kind of wound or injury,
yes,
and he has to go to hospital.
Yes.
Did you think that could have been Vermeer who gives him a clout?
Well, it is a nice thought, but I think Bolnes was hit in the house of the Tierling, where he was confined.
But Vermeer went and got him, didn't he? It must have been Vermeer. He would have given him a bob, eh?
It's nice to say so.
Willem Bolnes, violent son of a violent father, repeating the patterns of the past, spent the rest of his life in the House of Correction. I went to see the paintings in the Rijksmuseum to road test a theory that Vermeer painted away the pain of reality. They're luminous compared to the other paintings. The way that he's painted light is so extraordinary.
Yeah, and it's a very beautiful diffuse light, and you see the way it reflects and how he actually depicts the textures with the little dots in the bread, which nearly feels as if the bread is crumbling, but on the other hand you also see those little dots of reflection in the cloth.
My own theory about this picture is fairly straightforward. Isn't it possible that this picture could have been painted just after Willem Bolmers attacked Vermeer's wife and his mother-in-law, and a maid called Tanneke Everpol, perhaps this woman, stepped in?
And that he would have painted it as a kind of homage to the valiant maid who stepped in.
Why not?
Well, I think that's slightly a 19th century view as well, that the personal life of the artist would have a direct influence on what he would paint.
But don't you think it's interesting that a man with such a tempestuous domestic personal life should paint such fantastic images of
I think that's fascinating, because you walk around in a museum and you suddenly see this small Vermeer. It gives a sense of relief and tranquility. And
but in the background there's this mad brother-in-law with a sort of iron pin attacking women. So
and we know that he had 11 children, well actually probably 13, but we know that there were 11. So it must have been quite a busy.
Children hardly ever appear in his work, but I mean, they do appear in this picture, don't they? I mean, this is the only painting in which we get a kind of glimpse of children in Vermeer's art, isn't it?
Yeah. They're probably playing on the street. You don't know exactly what they do, because again here they're so intent on their own action. Yeah. And that's, I think, something which is very typical for Vermeer, that his characters are nearly always unaware of us as the spectators. It's an amazingly, I think, intimate view of a portrait of a street. It's nearly voyeurism. We're looking onto a scene and they don't know that we're there.
He creates all these little accidents. They're almost like snags, little rough edges in the texture, and they catch your eye like that fantastic bit of.
And that makes you accept it much more as reality, because you recognise it in its imperfection, and it also gives it more mystery, because he doesn't give you all the information bang in your face. It's a much more mysterious subject. No, he didn't really need to paint it, because it's not about her.
But this is fantastic. This sort of he paint different kinds of.
Well, here this is amazing, because here you have, as I interpret it, you have so many people have sat on this bench that you actually have the dirt and the discolory on the wall behind the bench.
So it's like the grease on an antimacassar. It's sort of accumulated human presence.
Exactly.
It is fantastic.
Yeah.
What a fine piece of work is a home, Vermeer seems to say, dwelling on every detail of bricks and mortar. By the mid-1660s, with his troublesome brother-in-law locked up and the scandals of his own family safely in the past, Vermeer was at the peak of his fortunes. Thanks to the wealth of his mother-in-law and the support of his patron, he could paint what he wanted. Perhaps, for a moment, his own life seemed nearly as perfect as the dream world of his art. But then came the fall. In 1672, the French army of Louis XIV invaded, and, crucially for Vermeer, the Dutch art market collapsed. Vermeer can now be traced through the archives because he seems to be conducting more and more business for his mother-in-law, Maria Tins. There was a legacy from her great-grandfather left to the charity chamber in Gouda, which she now wanted to claim. She sent her son-in-law to get it. The young man who once hadn't been good enough for her daughter now enjoyed her complete trust.
I'm the Virgin, not to be confused with the Virgin.
Even though Maria Tins now lived in Delft, the family still had wealth and influence here in Gouda.